There is a man sitting on a beach at the edge of the world, and he is crying. He has been on this island for 7 years. The woman who lives here is a goddess. She has offered him immortality. Actual, literal, never grow old, never die immortality. And a bed in paradise for the rest of time. Every morning he sleeps with her because he has no choice in the matter. Every afternoon he walks down to the shore, sits on the same rock, faces the water in the direction of home, and weeps until the sun goes down. His name is Odysseus. He is the most intelligent man alive. He is the one who thought of the wooden horse. The trick that ended the greatest war the Greek world ever fought and made him famous in every kingdom on the Mediterranean. The war took 10 years. Getting home has taken longer. He left Troy with 12 ships and 600 men. Right now, on this beach, there are none. No ships, no men. Every single one of them is dead, and most of them died because of a decision he made, and the sea between him and his wife is being held shut. Personally, deliberately, by Poseidon himself, who has sworn that Odysseus will never see his own island again. So the question underneath this whole story was, never will he make it home. It is, what did he do? What does a man have to have done for the gods themselves to look at 10 years of war and decide that surviving it was not nearly punishment enough? To answer that, we have to go back, past the shipwrecks, past the monsters, past the war itself, all the way back to a wedding. Because every single thing that happens to this man begins with an argument between 3 women over a piece of fruit. The wedding was supposed to be the happiest day the gods had ever thrown. A sea goddess named Thetis was marrying a mortal man. This almost never happened, and it was not romance that arranged it. There had been a prophecy that Thetis would bear a son greater than his father. And when Zeus heard it, he stopped wanting her immediately. A son greater than Zeus was not a blessing, it was a coup. So the king of the gods did what powerful men have always done with a dangerous woman. He married her off quickly to someone harmless, a decent mortal king named Peleus. Let the prophecy spend itself on a man who would be dead in 50 years. Every god on Olympus was invited. The tables were set on the slopes of Mount Pelion, and for one afternoon the immortals came down and behaved like a family. But one guest was left off the list. Her name was Eris, and she was the goddess of strife. Not war. War had its own god. Eris was something smaller and far more useful. She was the spirit of the argument that starts over nothing and does not stop. She was uninvited for the obvious reason. You do not seat discord at a wedding, so she came anyway, and she did not make a scene. She did something much worse. She rolled a single golden apple onto the floor of the hall, and on it were carved 2 words, "To the fairest," and then she left. Consider how little that is. No weapon, no curse, no army, a piece of fruit and an adjective, and the goddess of strife understood something about the people in that room that they did not understand about themselves. 3 goddesses reached for it. Hera, queen of heaven, wife of Zeus. Athena, goddess of wisdom and strategy. Aphrodite, goddess of desire, and not one of them could let it go. They took it to Zeus and demanded he judge between them. Zeus was, by any measure, the most powerful being in the universe, and he took one look at his wife, his daughter, and the goddess of love, and he refused. He would not touch it. Instead, he sent them down to a hillside in Asia Minor, to a shepherd boy who was minding cattle on the slopes above the city of Troy. The boy's name was Paris. He was a prince, the son of Priam, king of Troy, though he had been raised among herdsmen because there had been a prophecy about him too. This cosmos was thick with prophecies. Nobody in it ever managed to use one to change anything. The 3 most powerful goddesses in existence appeared to a teenager on a hill. and asked him which of them was the most beautiful. And then they bribed him. Hera offered power, rule over all of Asia, all of Europe, the largest kingdom any mortal had ever held. Athena offered victory, that he would win every battle he ever fought, that no army could stand against him, that he would be the greatest soldier who had ever lived. Aphrodite offered him the most beautiful woman in the world. He took the woman. It is easy to sneer at that. It is worth sitting with instead, because the choice is the whole story in miniature. Two goddesses offered him things that would have made him great, and one offered him something he simply wanted, and he was young, and he chose the thing he wanted. Whole civilizations would burn for it, and there was never a single moment in which Paris understood that he was choosing anything at all. But there was a problem with Aphrodite's offer, and she did not mention it. The most beautiful woman in the world was already married. Her name was Helen, and she was the wife of Menelaus, king of Sparta. And years before, when she had been of an age to marry, and every king and prince in Greece had come to compete for her, her stepfather Tyndareus had looked at that hall full of armed, wealthy, competitive men and realized he had a catastrophe on his hands. Whoever he chose, the others would kill. The solution came from one of the suitors himself, a young king from a small rocky island who was already at that age the cleverest man in the room. He suggested that every man present swear a binding oath. Whoever wins her, the rest of us will defend that marriage against anyone, forever. They swore it, all of them, and it worked exactly as designed. Menelaus took Helen home to Sparta, and nobody drew a blade. That oath was engineered to prevent a war. It is the single mechanism that would guarantee one. Because when Paris sailed to Sparta as a guest and sat at Menelaus's table and ate his food and drank his wine under the oldest and most sacred law the Greeks had, the law that a host and a guest are bound to protect each other, and then, left in the night with the man's wife and a good deal of the man's treasure, he did not merely commit adultery. He broke the one rule that the king of the gods personally enforced. Zeus of the guests. That was one of his titles. That was his jurisdiction. And every king in Greece had already sworn in advance to answer. The mobilization was the largest the Greek world had ever seen. Over 1,000 ships, kingdoms that had spent generations raiding each other, assembled into a single fleet, and at the head of it stood Agamemnon of Mycenae, Menelaus's older brother. A man who had wanted an empire his entire life and had just been handed a legal reason to build one. But two men did not want to go. Achilles was the son of that wedding. Thetis's boy, the child of the prophecy, the son greater than his father. His mother knew exactly what waited for him at Troy because she had been told he could live a long life in obscurity, or a short one that would be remembered for 3,000 years. She hid him, dressed him as a girl, and hid him among the daughters of a foreign king, and it very nearly worked. And on the island of Ithaca, a young king was ploughing his own fields with a yoke of mismatched animals, sowing salt into the furrows instead of seed, laughing at people who spoke to him, doing an extremely convincing impression of a man who had lost his mind. Odysseus had sworn the oath. He had invented the oath, and he had no intention whatsoever of honoring it. He had been married about a year. He had a son who was a few months old. He had a small kingdom, bad farmland, good goats, and a wife he had chosen for her mind. And every instinct he had was screaming that a war over another man's marriage was not worth one day away from any of it. So when the recruiters came, they found a madman. They almost believed him, but among them was a man named Polyphemus, who was nearly as clever as Odysseus and considerably less patient. He walked into the house, picked up the baby, carried him out to the field, and laid him on the ground directly in the path of the plough. Everything stops. The oxen keep walking, the blade comes on, and Odysseus, who has not broken character for a week, who has been eating dirt and talking to birds, turns the plough aside. He looked up. Palamedes looked back. Neither of them said anything because there was nothing to say. He went to war. He would spend the next 20 years finding new ways to be cleverer than everyone around him, and it would cost him every single thing he had just tried to protect. And he would never forgive Palamedes for it. Years later, at Troy, he would forge a letter, plant gold in the man's tent, and have him stoned to death as a traitor by the army he had helped assemble. That is not a rumor the Greeks whispered about Odysseus. That is a story they told about him openly, and they still called him the best of them. He had 1 year with his son. He would get the next 20 back as a stranger. And on the day the fleet finally sailed, 1,000 ships pointed east. The largest gathering of Greek power in history launched over a broken promise and a stolen wife. 2 of the 3 goddesses from that hillside were watching. Hera and Athena had been offered a golden apple by a Trojan boy, and he had handed it to someone else. Remember which 2, because in 10 years, one of them is going to change sides. The fleet never even got out of Greece. They gathered at Aeolus, 1,000 ships in a narrow strait, and the wind died. Not for a day, for weeks. 1,000 ships full of armed men with nothing to do, eating through their supplies, starting fights, watching the sails hang. And when Agamemnon finally asked the prophet why, he got an answer he did not want. Artemis was offended. Something about a stag, or a boast, or both. The stories disagree, and the reason has never mattered as much as the price. The goddess wanted payment, and the payment was his daughter. Iphigenia was brought to Aeolus under a lie. Her mother was told there was going to be a wedding, that the girl was to marry Achilles, the greatest young man in Greece. Clytemnestra dressed her daughter for a wedding and traveled to the coast to give her away. There was an altar, there was a knife, and her father used it. Some versions say Artemis snatched her at the last instant and left a deer in her place. The Greeks told that version because they needed to. But every version agrees on the part that matters. The wind came back. 1,000 ships sailed for Troy on a breeze bought with a girl's throat. And her mother went home to Mycenae and began to wait. What waited for them at Troy was not a battle. It was a city with walls that a god had built and no plan for getting through them. 9 years. That is the part almost everyone forgets. The famous poem about the Trojan War doesn't begin until year 10, so the 9 years before it disappear into a sentence. But they happened, and they were 9 years of the most tedious violence imaginable. The Greeks could not take the city, so they took everything around it. They raided the coast, they sacked the small towns, the allied cities, the villages that fed Troy. They burned farmland, killed men, and carried women back to camp as property. Achilles alone is credited with destroying 23 towns in those 9 years, and not one of them was Troy. They had built a town of their own on the beach by then. Ships dragged up and rotting, a wall around their own camp, because after 9 years the besiegers needed protecting too. Children had been born in that camp who had never seen Greece. And in the 10th year, for about an hour, it very nearly ended the way it should have ended on the first day. Somebody finally said the obvious thing out loud, that this was a quarrel between 2 men over 1 woman, and that the 2 men were both standing right there, and that thousands of people who had never met her were dying for it. Let Paris and Menelaus fight. Winner takes Helen and the treasure. Everyone else goes home. Both armies agreed instantly. They swore oaths over sacrificed lambs. They measured out the ground. 10 years of siege was about to be settled by 2 men in a marked-off square, while the whole of Troy watched from the walls and the whole Greek army sat down in the dust. And while they were preparing, Helen was up on the tower with Priam, and he asked her to name the Greek captains for him. That scene is one of the strangest in the poem, and it is the only time we really see her. The old king, whose city is under siege, whose sons are dying because of her, sits her down beside him and says, plainly, "I do not blame you, I blame the gods." And then he asks her who the big man is down there, and she tells him, "That is Agamemnon, my former brother-in-law. That one is Odysseus. That is Ajax." And then she looks for her own brothers, Castor and Pollux, and cannot find them anywhere in the line, and assumes they were too ashamed of her to come. Homer tells us in one quiet line that they were already dead and buried back in Sparta, and that she did not know. Down on the field, the duel went badly for Paris almost immediately. Menelaus broke a sword on his helmet, then grabbed him by the helmet strap and started dragging him bodily toward the Greek lines by the throat. And the strap cut off his air, and it was over. And Aphrodite snapped the strap. She put a mist around him and lifted him off the field and set him down in his own perfumed bedroom in Troy, and then went and fetched Helen from the tower to join him there. Helen refused. Aphrodite threatened her until she went. So Menelaus was left standing in an empty square with a broken sword and a helmet in his hand, looking for a man who was no longer on the planet, while Agamemnon shouted that the Greeks had won and demanded Helen back under the oath. They were right. Everyone knew they were right. Troy was about to hand her over, and Hera, who had been offered a golden apple on a hillside and had not received it, asked Zeus to break the truce because she wanted the city destroyed, not settled with. And Athena went down and found a Trojan archer named Pandarus and talked him into taking one shot at Menelaus while he stood there unarmed under a sworn truce. The arrow wounded him, not badly. Enough. The oaths were broken. Both armies stood up, and the war restarted, and it would run for another year and take Patroclus and Hector and Achilles and the entire city with it. It could have ended that morning. 2 goddesses would not allow it. Over a beauty contest, neither of them had won. And in the same 10th year, the Greek army very nearly destroyed itself over a girl and a point of pride. Agamemnon had taken a woman named Chryseis in one of those raids. Her father was a priest of Apollo, and he came to the camp with a ransom and begged for her back, and Agamemnon humiliated him and sent him away. So the priest prayed. And Apollo, the god of plague as well as light, walked down from Olympus and shot arrows into the Greek camp for 9 days, the animals first, then the men. The pyres burned day and night. When the army finally forced Agamemnon to give the girl back, he did it. And then, to make sure nobody mistook the concession for weakness, he took Achilles' woman instead, Briseis. Taken from the tent of the one man in that army nobody could replace, in front of everyone, for no reason except that Agamemnon could. And Achilles, who had killed more Trojans than any 10 men in the camp, who had no personal stake in Helen or Menelaus or any of it, who was there because of a prophecy and his own hunger to be remembered, put down his spear and walked away. He did not go home. He did something colder. He sat in his tent by his ships at the edge of the camp, and he waited for the Greeks to lose, and they lost. Without Achilles, the Trojans came out from behind their walls for the first time in a decade. Hector, Priam's eldest son, the man actually holding that city together, pushed the Greeks back across their own plain, over their own wall, down onto the beach, until there was fighting among the ships themselves, and men were throwing fire onto the hulls. The entire expedition was hours from ending in ash. They sent an embassy to Achilles. They offered him everything: the girl back untouched, 7 cities, gold, Agamemnon's own daughter in marriage. It was a king's ransom offered to a subordinate, and it was as close to an apology as Agamemnon was capable of. Achilles said no, not because the offer was too small, because he had worked out something the offer could not address. That he was going to die at Troy, that everyone dies, that the coward and the brave man go into the same ground, and that the only thing he was ever going to get out of any of this was the story people told afterwards, and Agamemnon had just proven that even that could be taken off him in front of witnesses whenever a superior felt insulted. So what exactly was he dying for? That question is the reason the poem has lasted 3,000 years. An army of men is dying on a beach for a marriage none of them are in, and the best fighter among them sits in his tent and asks out loud what any of it is worth. And nobody in the poem has an answer for him. But his closest companion did not have the luxury of the question. Patroclus had been with Achilles since they were boys. He watched the ships burn and the men die, and he could not sit in the tent one more hour, so he asked for one thing. Let me wear your armor, just the armor. Let them think you have come back, and they will break. Achilles agreed and gave him one instruction. Push them off the ships, then stop, do not chase them to the walls. It worked exactly as designed. The Trojans saw that armor coming and the line collapsed, and Patroclus, who had spent 10 years being the steady one, the kind one, the man everyone in that camp liked, felt what it was to be feared and did not stop. He chased them to the walls. Apollo struck him from behind and left him dazed and stripped in the open, and Hector put a spear through him and stood over him while he died. They fought over his body for the rest of the day. That is not a detail the poem includes for atmosphere. A body was the difference between a man who was mourned and a man who was eaten by dogs, and the Greeks dragged him back over ground that was, by the end of that afternoon, indistinguishable from a slaughterhouse floor. When they told Achilles, he went down into the dirt and poured ash over his own head and made a sound that his mother heard from the bottom of the sea. And then he went back to the war. Not for Agamemnon, not for Helen, not for the oath or the ships or Greece. He went back because his friend was dead, and he intended to make an entire city pay for it, and he no longer cared in the slightest that it would kill him. What followed is the most sustained passage of violence in ancient literature. He filled a river with corpses until the river itself rose up against him. He killed men who grabbed his knees and begged and told them plainly that Patroclus had been better than them, and Patroclus had died. So what exactly did they think they were owed? He was not a hero in those hours. He was a natural disaster with a name. And then he found Hector. Everyone else had gone inside the walls. Hector stayed out. And when Achilles came for him, the best man in Troy lost his nerve and ran, and they went around the city 3 times before he turned and fought. It was not a long fight. And then Achilles did the thing that could not be undone. He cut through the tendons of Hector's ankles, threaded a leather strap through them, tied the body to his chariot, and drove it back and forth in front of the walls of Troy, while the man's mother and father and wife watched from above. He did it for 12 days, in the heat, in the dust, dragging a father's son past his father's house every morning. The gods themselves eventually could not stand it. Apollo kept the body whole out of sheer disgust. And it is worth being clear about why. This was not a warrior's cruelty. Troy had been prepared to lose Hector. Wars kill princes. What Achilles was doing was denying the city its funeral, and to a Greek that was not brutality, it was blasphemy. a crime not against Hector, but against the order of things. So an old man came to end it. Priam was king of a city under siege in his 70s, and he crossed the plain at night, alone, unarmed, with a wagon of gold, through the entire Greek army into the tent of the man who had killed his son. Nobody stopped him. A god walked with him, and even so, everything about it should have ended with his death. He knelt, and he took the hands of Achilles and kissed them, and said the line that ended the rage of the greatest killer of the age. I have endured what no man on earth has endured before. I put my lips to the hands of the man who killed my son. And Achilles, 20-something, grieving, a fortnight into desecrating a corpse, thought about his own father, who was old and who was going to get news like this soon, and the two of them sat in that tent and wept. Not together exactly. Priam for Hector, Achilles for Patroclus and for his father, and for himself. Two men on opposite sides of a 10-year war, crying about the same thing at the same time. Then he fed the old man and gave him the body, and asked how many days he needed for the funeral, and personally guaranteed that not one Greek would attack until they were finished. 11 days. He gave him 12. That is the only act of mercy in 10 years of that war, and it happens between the two people with the most reason on earth to refuse it. Which raises the question the next decade of these men's lives is going to answer, whether they want it answered or not. If both sides are capable of that, how do you end a war that everyone involved has forgotten how to stop? Achilles did not die in a duel. After Hector, after the funeral games, after everything, he was killed by the man who had started the war. Paris, the shepherd prince, the one who chose the woman, put an arrow into the one place on Achilles' body that could be hurt. Some say Apollo guided it. Every version agrees on the indignity. The greatest warrior of the age, brought down by an archer from a distance, by a man nobody in either army respected. Paris did not outlive him by much. He took a poisoned arrow himself not long after, and went to his brother's widow city to die in it. And with both of them gone, the war simply stopped moving. 10 years in, the two men whose names the whole thing had been built around were dead, and the situation was precisely what it had been in year 1. The Greeks were on the beach. The Trojans were behind the walls. The walls were still standing because a god had built them, and men do not knock down what gods build. There was no version of this that ended in a victory, not by force. Every man in that camp had understood it for years, and none of them had said it out loud, because saying it out loud meant that Iphigenia and Patroclus and Achilles and 9 years of their own lives had bought nothing at all. So the war was not going to be won by the strongest man there. It was going to be won by the one who was willing to think about it like a problem instead of a fight. And before the horse, there was a list. The Greeks captured a Trojan seer, Helenus, Priam's own son, a man with the same gift as his sister Cassandra and the crucial advantage of being believed, and under whatever pressure they applied, he told them the conditions. Troy was not going to fall until certain things were true, and none of them had anything to do with fighting. They needed Achilles' son, who was a boy on an island and had never seen a battle. They needed the bow of Heracles, and they needed the Palladium, a small wooden image of Athena that had fallen from the sky, kept in her temple at the heart of the city. While it stood there, Troy could not be taken. Odysseus went and got all three. He sailed to Scyros and collected Neoptolemus, and this is the same island where 20 years earlier Achilles' mother had hidden the boy's father in a dress to keep him out of this war. Odysseus had found him there too, He had laid out gifts for the king's daughters, jewelry and cloth, and a spear and a shield among them, and then had a trumpet sounded, and one of the girls went for the weapons. That is how Achilles got to Troy. Odysseus recruited the father with a trick, and now he came back to the same beach for the son, and the son said yes immediately because he had grown up on stories about a man he had never met. Then the bow, and this is the errand that should be remembered. The bow of Heracles belonged to a man named Philoctetes, who had sailed with the fleet in the first year. On the way out, he was bitten by a snake, and the wound would not close. It rotted, and it stank, and he screamed, constantly, unbearably, so that the men could not eat near him, or sleep near him, or perform sacrifices with the noise going on. So the Greek command marooned him. They put him ashore on the island of Lemnos with his bow and some rags, and left him there. He survived for 10 years alone, shooting birds to eat, dragging a leg that would not heal, on an island with nothing but time to think about who had done it to him. And the man who had advised abandoning him was Odysseus. So he had to sail back to Lemnos and stand in front of a man he had personally left to die, and talk him into getting on a ship and helping the people who had done it. There are whole tragedies written about that conversation. In most versions, it does not go well. Philoctetes refuses, and it takes the ghost of Heracles himself appearing to order him aboard. But the ending is always the same. The man comes back. He is healed by the Greek physicians in a matter of days, which means the wound they exiled him over for a decade was always treatable. And then he took the bow up onto the field and killed Paris with it. The war that started with Paris ended at the human level with an arrow from the man the Greeks had thrown away. Last was the Palladium, and that one Odysseus did himself. He had already been inside Troy once. He had beaten himself bloody, put on rags, and walked into the city as a runaway slave to scout it, and been recognized by Helen of all people who did not give him away. Now he went back a second time, with Diomedes, over the wall at night, into the temple, and they took the goddess's image out of her own sanctuary and carried it down to the ships. It worked. It was necessary. It was, by the count of the conditions, the thing that made victory possible. It was also the second time in this war that a Greek walked into a temple of Athena and took something that was hers. The first time she helped them do it. The idea was insane. Build a horse. An enormous wooden horse, tall as a house, hollow, on wheels. Put your best men inside it. Then burn your camp. Burn 10 years of shelter, every hut, every store, everything. Put the entire fleet in the water and sail away over the horizon, and leave the horse standing alone on an empty beach with an inscription on its flank, offering it to Athena as a parting gift. Every part of that plan is a bet on someone else's psychology. It requires the enemy to want it. It requires them to be so exhausted, so desperate for the thing to be over, that when they walk out onto that beach in the morning and find 10 years of siege replaced by silence and a gift, they will decide it means what they need it to mean. The Greeks built it out of the timbers of their own ships. Then they sailed to Tenedos, an island just far enough over the horizon to be invisible from the walls, and waited. And they left one man behind. Sinon let himself be captured. He was dragged to Priam in ropes, and he told a story that was almost entirely true, which is what made it work. That the Greeks had gone home, that they had wanted to sacrifice him for a safe voyage the way Agamemnon had sacrificed his own daughter, that he had run, that he hated them. He wept doing it. And when they asked about the horse, he told them the Greeks had built it deliberately too large to fit through Troy's gates, because if the Trojans ever got it inside, the city could never be taken. He gave them a reason to want it that had nothing to do with the horse and everything to do with pride. Not everyone believed him. A priest named Laocoon came down to the beach and told them exactly what it was. He said the sentence that has outlived him by 3,000 years, that he feared the Greeks, especially when they were bringing gifts. And he took a spear and drove it into the horse's flank, and the men inside it heard the point come through the wood beside them and did not make a sound. And then 2 serpents came out of the sea and took him and both his sons in front of the whole city. The Trojans watched a priest who had just called the horse a trap be publicly destroyed by something from the water, and drew the only conclusion available to frightened people: the gods had punished him for touching it. He was right. He was killed for being right, and being killed for it is what convinced everyone he was wrong. And there was one more voice. Cassandra was Priam's daughter, and years earlier Apollo had wanted her, and she had refused him, and his revenge was not to kill her or curse her family. It was subtler, and it was worse. He let her keep the gift of prophecy and took away the ability to be believed. She would see everything correctly, in detail, forever. And every person she told would hear noise. She came down and screamed at them that the horse was full of men. She said it plainly. She was the king's own daughter. They took her home and shut the door. There is no crueler idea in Greek myth than Cassandra, and it is not really about prophecy at all. Everyone has stood in a room where the true thing was said out loud, and the room decided not to hear it. The Greeks just made the mechanism divine and honest. So they widened the gate. That is the detail worth holding on to. It did not fit. Sinon had told them it would not fit, on purpose, and rather than take that as a reason to leave it on the beach, the Trojans took apart a section of their own wall. The wall a god had built, the wall that no army on earth had breached in 10 years. To make the opening bigger, nobody defeated the defenses of Troy. Troy dismantled them from the inside in a good mood. They brought it in at evening. They put garlands on it. They danced around it in the streets and drank as a city drinks when a 10-year war has ended, and by the middle of the night the whole place was asleep with its wall open. Sinon lit a torch on the ramparts. The fleet came back from Tenedos in the dark, and the men in the horse climbed down into a city that had no idea it was still at war. What happened next is where this story stops being a triumph, and it is the part most retellings hurry past. They burned it. That was expected. Cities that are stormed get burned. What was not expected, what the Greeks themselves recorded with something close to horror, is what specific things were done and where. Priam was an old man who had crossed a battlefield alone to kiss the hands of his son's killer. When the Greeks came into the palace, he did what any Greek in the world would have said was correct. He went to the household altar, the one place violence does not go, and he put his hands on it. Achilles' son found him there and killed him on it, and the blood went onto the stone of the altar itself. Hector's son, Astyanax, was a baby, not a symbol, an infant in a room in his mother's arms. And the Greek command made a considered decision about him because he was the male heir of Troy, and one day he would be a man with a claim and a reason. They took him from her and threw him off the walls his father had died defending. And Cassandra, who had told them, who had been telling them for years, ran to the temple of Athena and took hold of the goddess's own statue, which under every law the Greeks recognized, made her untouchable. Ajax the Lesser dragged her out of it. He dragged her so hard that the statue came off its base and fell, and then he raped her in the temple of the goddess of wisdom. Sit with the arrangement of that. For 10 years, every morning, the Greek army had prayed to Athena. She had been on their side from the beginning. She had been at that hillside, she had been offered the apple, she had been passed over for a Trojan boy, and she had spent a decade helping them. She guided Odysseus, she protected Diomedes. The horse itself was dedicated to her. It was her idea as much as anyone's. They had one night to keep her, and in that one night, they killed a suppliant on an altar, murdered an infant as policy, and violated a priestess inside her own temple while holding her goddess's image. There is a version of this story where the Greeks win the Trojan War. It is the version that stops at the horse. Everyone knows that version. The clever trick, the famous line about gifts, the city falling at dawn. But the Greeks did not stop at the horse, and neither did their own poets. The people who invented these stories went out of their way to record what their heroes did in that city, and then they wrote 10 more years of consequences for it. That is not squeamishness. That is a civilization telling itself something on purpose. They had prayed to her every morning for 10 years. It took them one night to lose her. Athena went to Poseidon that same night and asked for a storm, not for Troy. Troy was already gone. She asked for it for the fleet. Every man who pushed a ship off that beach in the morning was already condemned. The war was over, the ships were loaded, the plunder was aboard, and they were laughing. 1,000 ships pointed west, home, 10 years late, with the sea in front of them, and no idea whatsoever that it had just been closed. The Greeks had a word for this: Nostos, the homecoming. It was not a small word for them. It meant the return, the arrival, the moment a man walks back into his own house and becomes himself again. And it mattered so much that they built an entire body of stories around it, separate from the war, telling what happened to each king on the way back. Those stories are mostly lost now. What survives of them is enough. Because here is what the Greeks themselves believed about the Trojan War, and it is not what most people assume. They did not think it was a victory. They thought it was a wound. And they told the story of the aftermath as an accounting. Every king going home to exactly what he had earned. It began before the fleet had cleared the horizon. The Greeks could not even agree on when to leave. Half the army wanted to sail immediately. Half wanted to stay and sacrifice to Athena first, because some of them had worked out what had been done in her temple and were frightened. The fleet split on the beach in an argument, which is a fitting last act for that army, and went out in pieces. Then the storm came. It caught them at sea between Troy and Euboea, and it was not weather. Athena had asked for it, and Poseidon had built it, and the sky over that fleet came apart. Ships that had survived 10 years of war went down in a single night with everything they had spent a decade taking. Somewhere in the dark, gold from the treasuries of Troy went to the bottom of the Aegean, along with the men who had carried it out. Ajax the Lesser, the one from the temple, survived it. Poseidon actually spared him. He was thrown against a rock formation and he held on, and the sea broke over him all night and did not take him. By morning he was alive on a wet rock in an empty sea, and he had a choice about what to say. What he said was that he had survived in spite of the gods, that no god had saved him, that he had done it himself. Poseidon heard it, struck the rock with his trident, and split it. Ajax went into the water with the piece he was holding. Hold on to that, because it is going to happen again to a better man, for the same reason. This story has one lesson it teaches twice, and it is not about strength or cleverness. It is about what a man says out loud when he thinks he has got away with something. Agamemnon had the fastest crossing of anyone. That is the joke the Greeks were making, and it is a cruel one. The commander of the expedition, the man who had sacrificed his daughter for the wind, sailed home almost without incident. He arrived in Mycenae in good order, with his ships, his plunder, and his prize. Cassandra, taken from the temple, brought back as property, and his wife had prepared a welcome. Clytemnestra had spent 10 years in that palace. She had watched her daughter dressed for a wedding that was an execution. She had ruled in his absence, taken his cousin Aegisthus as a lover and a partner, and she had thought about this day for a decade, with nothing to interrupt her. She met him at the shore. She had a purple cloth laid down from the ship to the palace door so his feet would not touch the ground. And he walked on it in front of the whole city, which no Greek should ever have done, because that was how you honored a god. She wanted him to. She wanted the city to see him do it. Then she drew him a bath. There are different accounts of the mechanics, and they hardly matter. A net or a robe with no opening for the head, something to tangle his arms while he was naked and wet and unarmed. And then an axe. Cassandra saw all of it before it happened, standing in the courtyard, describing the murder of her captor and her own death in detail to a chorus of old men who could hear her perfectly and could not believe a word. Then she walked into the house anyway, because she had known for 20 years that seeing it changes nothing. The commander of the greatest army in Greek history was killed indoors without a weapon in his hand by his wife on the day he came home. 10 years of war, and his reign lasted from the beach to the bathhouse, and that death did not end there either. His son, Orestes, would come back years later and kill his mother for it, and be hunted by the Furies for doing it, and the whole thing would eventually require a trial by the gods themselves to stop. A blood feud that ran 3 generations because one man wanted wind for his ships. Menelaus is the one nobody expects. He was the wronged husband. The entire war was fought on his behalf. He had every claim to a clean return, and he got Helen back. That is the part people forget. He found her in the burning city with his sword drawn, fully intending to kill her, and did not. And it took him 8 years to get home. He was blown south, off the map, to Egypt. He drifted along the coast of North Africa and around Cyprus and Phoenicia, collecting a fortune he had no way to spend, pinned down for 20 days at a time on an island with no wind, until he had to ambush a shape-shifting sea god on a beach and wrestle him through every form he could take, just to be told why. And the answer was that he had not sacrificed properly before leaving. That was all. A missed observance. 8 years. For a technicality. He got home in the end, to Sparta, to a large house and a great deal of gold, and the most beautiful woman in the world sitting across from him. And every account of him afterwards has the same strange, flat quality to it. The war was for her, he got her back, and nobody in any story ever describes them as happy. Now look at who did get home. Nestor. The old king of Pylos, the one everybody in the camp found slightly tedious, who told long stories about his youth and gave advice nobody wanted. He sailed straight home, easily, without incident, and lived out a long life surrounded by his sons. Nestor was in the argument on the beach, and he was on the side that wanted to leave immediately, before the sacrifices, before the delay. He was gone before the worst of it. He had counseled restraint in the city. His hands were, by the standards of that army, clean. Diomedes, one of the great fighters of the war, a man who had wounded 2 gods in a single afternoon, got home to find his wife had taken a lover and the city turned against him and left Greece for Italy. Idomeneus of Crete caught in the storm, swore to sacrifice the first living thing he saw on shore if he was spared, and the first living thing he saw was his son. Different versions have him do it, or refuse it. Both versions end with him exiled. Line them up. Nestor, who left early, home in weeks. Menelaus, who took the treasure but spared his wife. 8 years. Idomeneus and Diomedes, good soldiers with bad returns, exiled. Ajax, who committed the sacrilege and then bragged about surviving it, dead in the water. Agamemnon, who killed his own daughter to start it, dead in his own bathroom on day 1. The men who did the least got home fastest. Every single one of them was paid out in proportion, and the Greeks arranged the story that way deliberately, because they were not writing about a war. They were writing about what the war did to the people who won it, which leaves one man unaccounted for, the one who was not on the beach for the argument because he was busy, the one who had run the whole operation from inside, who talked his way into the city, who forged the letter that got Palamedes stoned, who was in the horse, who came out of the horse, who was in that palace on the worst night in the history of Troy. The one who had invented the trick that made all of it possible. He had 12 ships, he had 600 men. He was 3 days clear sailing from a small rocky island with bad farmland, a wife, and a son who was now 10 years old and had never seen his face. So what happens to the man who thought of the horse? The first place they stopped, they attacked. This is the detail that gets sanded off almost every retelling of the Odyssey, and it should not be, because the journey does not begin with a shipwreck or a monster or bad luck. It begins with a raid. The wind took them north to Ismarus, a town on the Thracian coast belonging to a people called the Ticones. It was not on their route home. It had nothing to do with Troy. It was simply there, and it was rich, and there were 12 ships full of men who had spent 10 years learning that a coastline is a thing you take. So they sacked it. They killed the men, took the women, divided the goods on the beach. And then Odysseus told them to get back in the ships, and they refused. They had wine now, good wine, taken from a priest of Apollo who had begged for his family's lives and paid for them with the best 12 jars in the town. And they had meat, and they were on a beach in the sun for the first time in a decade, with nobody shooting at them. Odysseus said, "Leave." They said no, and he did not make them. The men of Ismarus who had escaped went inland overnight and came back at dawn with their relatives, and these were not townspeople. They were Thracians who fought from chariots, and there were a great many of them, and they came down onto that beach and killed 72 Greeks before the rest could get the ships off the sand. 6 men from every ship, gone in a morning on the first stop for a hangover. That is how this begins, not with a curse, with an army of professional raiders being unable to stop raiding, and a captain who was not willing to be unpopular for one afternoon. Then the storm took them for 9 days and put them somewhere that was not on any map. They came ashore among people who lived on a flower. That is the entire threat. No weapons, no hostility. The Lotus Eaters were, by every account, friendly. They offered the scouting party some of what they ate, and the men ate it, and it was sweet, and within an hour they did not want to leave. Not because they were drugged into stupor, something more precise than that. They stopped wanting to go home. Ithaca was still there, the wife was still there, the child was still there, and none of it seemed worth a boat ride anymore. They wept when they were dragged away, and Odysseus had to have them tied down under the benches while they cried for a plant. Everything else that happens in this story is survived by cleverness. This is the one danger that cleverness makes worse. The smarter a man is, the better the reasons he can construct for staying. Odysseus does not outthink the lotus. He simply refuses to taste it and physically removes his men before they can finish the thought. 10 years later, on Calypso's island, this exact danger will come back wearing a much better disguise, and he will spend 7 years not eating it. And then they came to the island of the Cyclopes, and Odysseus made the worst decision of his life for the most human reason there is. He wanted to see. They landed at night on a small offshore island, deserted, full of wild goats, so much food that the men ate for a full day and could have simply reprovisioned and left. Across a narrow strait was the mainland, where smoke rose and sheep could be heard. There was no need to go. There was no shortage of anything. He went because he wanted to know what lived there. He says so himself. He took 12 men and 1 skin of that Ismarian wine, the very best of it, the priest's wine, the ransom for a family's lives, and rowed across to have a look at the cave. The cave was enormous and full of cheese, racks of it drying, pens of lambs and kids sorted by age, vessels of milk. It was a working dairy kept by somebody meticulous, and the men took one look and told him to load the cheese and the animals onto the ship and go. Right then, immediately, while it was empty. He said no. He wanted to meet the owner and see whether he would give them a guest gift. He was standing inside a stranger's house, planning to take his food and expecting hospitality for it. Because that was the law. A host feeds a guest. A guest is under the protection of Zeus. Odysseus had spent his whole life in a world where that rule held, and it had never once occurred to him to check whether the rule ran this far from home. Then the light in the entrance went out, because something was filling it. Polyphemus drove his flocks in for the evening, and then he picked up a slab of rock that 22 four-wheeled wagons could not have shifted, and set it across the doorway. He asked who they were. Odysseus gave him the whole speech. Greeks from Troy, men of Agamemnon, we ask for the gift a host owes a guest, and Zeus himself protects the suppliant. And the Cyclops laughed at him and explained quite reasonably that the Cyclops were older than Zeus and cared nothing for him, and that he would do whatever he liked. Then he reached out, took 2 of the men and dashed their heads against the floor like a man killing rabbits, and ate them. Everything, bones, organs, all of it, and lay down among his sheep and went to sleep. Odysseus drew his sword in the dark and got within a step of putting it through the giant's chest, and then he stopped because he had worked out the trap. If the Cyclops died, the door did not open. That stone was going to stay across the entrance forever, with 11 Greeks sealed behind it. Killing him was suicide with a delay. So he put the sword away and spent the night thinking, while the thing that had eaten his men slept 10 feet away. In the morning, Polyphemus ate 2 more for breakfast, took the flocks out, and sealed them in. That is the day Odysseus becomes the man the rest of this story is about. Locked in a cave, 4 men dead, no exit, no weapon that helps, and no possible ally. And he builds a plan out of the only 3 things in the room: an olive stake he can sharpen, a skin of the strongest wine in the world, and a name. The stake was a green olive club the size of a ship's mast. They cut it down, sharpened it, hardened the point in the fire, and hid it under the dung on the floor. That evening the giant came back, sealed the door, and ate 2 more. And Odysseus walked up to him with a bowl of the priest's wine. That wine was the reason 72 men died at Ismarus. It was undiluted, and it was so strong that its original owner had mixed 1 part of it into 20 parts of water. Polyphemus had never had anything but milk in his life. He drank it neat, 3 bowls of it, and it went through him like a hammer, and in that warm, pleased, unguarded state, he asked his guest's name. and promised him a gift in return. Nobody. My name is Nobody. My mother and father call me Nobody, and so do all my friends. The gift was that nobody would be eaten last. Then he went over backwards, drunk, and vomited wine and pieces of the men he had eaten, and passed out. They put the stake in the fire until the green wood glowed. 4 men lifted it with him, and they drove it into the eye, and leaned on it, and turned it. Homer describes it exactly like a shipwright boring a hole through a plank with a drill, 2 men below working the strap, and that ordinary carpentry image is far more horrible than any amount of shrieking would have been. The eye hissed. The root of it crackled. The eyeball burst around the wood, and Polyphemus screamed loud enough to bring every Cyclops on that mountain running to his door in the dark. They stood outside and shouted in, "Who is hurting you? Is somebody killing you by force or by trickery?" And he answered honestly at the top of his voice, "Nobody is killing me." So they told him that if nobody was hurting him, it must be a sickness from Zeus, and there was nothing they could do, and they should all pray about it. And they went back to bed. That is the joke. That is the single most famous trick in Western literature, and it is a pun. A man saved his own life and the lives of 6 friends with wordplay in the dark, while blind fingers swept the floor of a sealed cave looking for him. In the morning, the blinded giant sat in the doorway with his hands out to catch anything that tried to walk past him. So they did not walk. Odysseus lashed the rams together in 3s with willow withies and slung a man beneath the middle one of each, and took the biggest ram for himself and hung underneath it by its fleece with his face in the wool, and waited. And the ram was slow leaving because of the weight, and Polyphemus stopped it in the doorway and put his hands on its back, and talked to it, asked it why it was last today when it was always first, wondered aloud whether the animal was grieving for its master's eye, said that if only it could speak, it would tell him where nobody was hiding. Right above his fingers, holding onto the fleece, was the man he was describing. Then he let it go. They got the flocks aboard. They pushed off. They were clear, actually clear, out of the strait, out of range, 6 men lighter but alive and moving, with the whole story already forming into the kind of thing men tell in halls for the rest of their lives. And Odysseus stood up in the stern and shouted back at the shore. He mocked him first, that this was payment for eating guests. The Cyclops tore off the top of a hill and threw it at the sound. It landed just beyond the bow, and the wash nearly drove them back onto the beach, and the crew begged him, literally begged him, they said it out loud, "Why do you want to provoke him?" To sit down and be quiet. He would not sit down. He shouted his name. "If anyone asks who blinded you, say it was Odysseus, sacker of cities, son of Laertes, whose home is in Ithaca." He gave a blind giant his name, his father's name, and his home address. And Polyphemus lifted his hands to the sky and prayed to his father, who is Poseidon, who is the god of the sea, on which Odysseus is currently standing, 200 miles from anywhere, with 2,000 of them left to cross. Grant that Odysseus never reach his home, or if he must, let him come late and badly in another man's ship, having lost all his companions. And let him find trouble in his house. And his father heard him. Consider what that boast actually cost. He had escaped by making himself nothing. That was the entire mechanism. Nobody is what unlocks the door. Nobody is what sends the neighbors home. Being no one at all is the reason 6 men are alive on that ship. The cleverest man in the world had found the one trick that works against a force stronger than him, and it required him to give up the credit. He could not do it. Not for a mile, not for an hour. He got out of the cave, got out of the strait, and could not stand to get away with it anonymously. One sentence. That sentence cost him 10 years, 600 men, 12 ships, and 20 years of his son's life. Everything from here, every monster, every drowning, every island. Is that prayer being answered clause by clause, exactly as it was worded? And every clause of it is going to come true. Late, alone, in another man's ship, trouble in the house. Remember the wording. It is a contract, and it is going to be honored to the letter. For a little while after that, everything went right. That is the cruel part. They came to a floating island with a wall of bronze around it, ruled by a man named Aeolus, whom Zeus had made keeper of the winds. He had 6 sons and 6 daughters, and he had married them to each other, and they all lived in one hall, feasting every day of the year, which the poem reports without a flicker of judgment, and which tells you something about how far from the ordinary world they had already sailed. Aeolus liked Odysseus. He kept them a full month and made him tell the entire story of Troy from the beginning, and when they left, he gave the greatest parting gift in Greek myth. He took every wind that could blow them off course, put them into a leather bag made from the hide of a 9-year-old ox, tied it shut with a bright silver cord, and stowed it in the hold of Odysseus's ship. Then he sent the west wind, the one wind they needed, to blow steadily behind them all the way to Ithaca. It was a solved problem, a guaranteed voyage. There was nothing left to do but hold the steering oar. Odysseus held it himself for 9 days and 9 nights. He would not let anyone else touch it, would not sleep, would not explain what was in the bag. And on the 10th day they saw Ithaca, not a rumor of it, not a shape on the horizon. They came close enough to see the fires on the shore, close enough to make out men moving around them. Home in daylight, near enough to shout at, and Odysseus, who had not slept in 9 days, finally lay down. The crew had been watching that bag for 9 days. They had watched their captain guard it and refuse to say what was inside, and they had done the arithmetic that men do. Aeolus had loved him, Aeolus had given him something heavy in a sealed bag, and Aeolus had given the rest of them nothing at all. They had fought the same war, they had rowed the same distance, and they were going to walk into their own houses with empty hands while he walked into his with a fortune. So while he slept, within sight of the fires on his own beach, they untied the silver cord to see how much gold he had been hiding. Every wind in the world came out at once. The storm took the whole fleet backwards over 10 days of sea in a matter of hours. Odysseus woke to the sound of it and knew instantly what had happened, and he considered, he says this plainly, going over the side and drowning himself right there. He decided against it, wrapped his head in his cloak, and lay in the bottom of the ship without speaking, while it blew them all the way back to the bronze island. He went up to the hall a second time and asked for help. And Aeolus threw him out. "Get off my island, you most miserable creature alive. It is not lawful for me to help a man the gods so plainly hate." That is the reading from the outside. From the outside, this looks like divine hatred. Because from the outside, there is no visible difference between a cursed man and a man whose crew does not trust him. Aeolus does not know about the Cyclops. He simply sees a man who was handed a solved problem and turned up 10 days later with it broken, and draws the obvious conclusion. It was not the gods that opened the bag. It was 600 men who had watched their commander keep a secret and had decided correctly that he did not consider them partners. They rowed away from the bronze island by hand, with no wind at all, and this time the men understood that the loss was their own doing, which made it worse. 6 days of rowing brought them to a harbor that looked perfect. That was the trap, and it was geography, not malice. The harbor of the Laestrygonians is a narrow inlet with high cliffs on both sides and a mouth barely wide enough for a hull. The finest natural anchorage imaginable, No swell, no wind, glassy water. 11 ships went straight in and tied up side by side. Odysseus moored his own ship outside, on the open coast, against the rock, with a line to a crag. He never explains why. He does it every time now. Hangs back, keeps 1 foot outside, sends someone else first. The man who walked into the Cyclops' cave to see who lived there has stopped doing that. He sent 3 scouts. They met a girl at a spring who was perfectly pleasant and directed them to her father's house, and her mother turned out to be the size of a mountain crag, and her father came in and picked up one of the 3 and prepared him for dinner without a word. The other 2 ran. And the giant king went out and shouted, and the Laestrygonians came. Thousands of them along the tops of the cliffs, looking down into that lovely, sheltered harbour where 11 ships were packed together with nowhere to turn. They threw rocks, not weapons, boulders off the cliff tops into a stone bathtub full of wooden ships. The poem gives it almost no space at all. A few lines. And that brevity is the horror of it. There was no fight. There was nothing to fight. Ships splintering, men in the water, and the giants coming down to the shallows and spearing them like fish and carrying them away for a meal. 540 men and 11 ships were destroyed in the time it takes to read about it. Odysseus drew his sword and cut his own mooring line and screamed at his crew to row, and they went out of that place over the bodies of everyone else they had ever known. 1 ship. 40-odd men. That is what is left of the army that took Troy, and it is worth saying clearly because the story never stops to say it. The 11 ships did nothing wrong. They did not open a bag or eat a sacred cow or insult a god. They sailed into a beautiful harbour on a calm morning. The curse did not need them to make a mistake. It just needed them to be with him. They came to Aeolus half dead, and lay on the beach for 2 days and 2 nights without moving. On the 3rd day, Odysseus climbed inland and saw smoke rising from a house in the middle of a wood, and came back and split the men into 2 parties, and they drew lots to decide who would go and look. And the man who lost wept, and so did the men who stayed, because by now everyone understood exactly what a house in the middle of a wood was likely to cost. 22 men went with Eurylochus. The house was beautiful, ringed with wolves and mountain lions that did not attack but came up fawning like dogs, which should have told them everything. Inside, a woman was singing at an enormous loom. She fed them. She was generous about it. Cheese and barley and honey and wine mixed in a bowl, offered with real warmth to exhausted men who had just watched their friends eaten. She stirred a drug into it that took away all memory of home. And when they had drunk it, she touched them with a wand and drove them out into the pigsties, and they had the bodies and bristles and voices of swine, and their minds were entirely unchanged. That is the specific horror of Circe, not transformation. Retention. They knew. 22 men stood in a sty in the shape of animals, understanding perfectly what had happened, unable to say one word about it, and she threw them acorns. Eurylochus had hung back outside. He had learned the same lesson as his captain, and he ran to the ship and could not speak for a while, and then told them. Odysseus went alone, and on the path he was met by Hermes, who gave him the only piece of straightforwardly divine help in the entire journey, a plant with a black root and a white flower called moly, which the gods can pull up and men cannot. It would make him immune. And instructions. When she strikes with the wand, draw your sword and go at her as if to kill her, and she will offer you her bed, and do not refuse, but make her swear a great oath first, that she will not use the moment to unman you. It went exactly as Hermes said. She mixed the cup, he drank it, she touched him with the wand and told him to go to the sty with the others. And he drew the sword and came at her, and she went down at his knees and knew immediately who he was, because she had been told years ago that a man immune to her drugs would come, and his name. She swore the oath. He got his men back. She rubbed a different drug on each of them, and the bristles fell away, and they were men again, younger and taller and better looking than before, and they all wept, and even Circe was moved. And then they stayed for a year. There is no danger left in that house. She has sworn, she is generous, she is honest, the food is endless, the wine is good, and there is a bed for the captain and comfort for everyone else. It is the safest place they have been since they left Troy. A year, not 7 days, not a season, 12 months, in a warm house, eating well, with nothing whatsoever going wrong. And the poem records, and this is the detail that changes what kind of man you think Odysseus is, that at the end of that year, it was the crew who came to him. His own men had to take their captain aside and say in so many words, "Strange man, it is time to remember Ithaca." He had not brought it up. He wept on Calypso's beach every afternoon for 7 years. He did not weep here. Here he sat at a good table with a goddess who liked him in a house with no threats and let a year go by and needed to be reminded. Which raises a question the story is going to keep asking, in one form or another, all the way to the last chapter. How long does a man have to be away before going home stops being the thing he is doing, and starts being the thing he is putting off? When he finally told Circe they were leaving, she agreed at once. She had never been the obstacle. And then she told him the condition. He could not sail to Ithaca. Not yet. No living man reaches home from this part of the world without first going somewhere else, out past the edge of the map, to the place where the ocean ends, to speak with the dead. He needed to consult a prophet named Tiresias, who had been the greatest seer in Greece, and who was dead, and who was still dead. The only being who could tell him how to get home. Homer says Odysseus's heart broke. He sat on the bed and wept and did not want to live anymore. This is the man who had just spent a year comfortable in that house, and the moment the road forward became real, it went straight down. He asked the obvious question. Who guides a ship to the land of the dead? And she told him nobody does. Put up the mast, spread the sail, and sit down. The north wind will carry the ship. They went out past the river ocean to a coast where the Cimmerians live in permanent fog, a place where the sun never shows, not at dawn, not at setting, where the people live their whole lives under a lid of cloud. He beached the ship and did exactly what Circe had instructed, and every step of it matters because this is not an adventure. It is a ritual, and the poem records it like a recipe. He dug a trench, a cubit each way. He poured 3 libations around it, honey and milk, then sweet wine, then water, and sprinkled white barley over the whole thing. He made promises to the dead that when he got home he would sacrifice his best barren heifer and heap the pyre with treasure, and that for Tiresias alone he would offer an all-black ram, the finest in his flocks. And then he cut the throats of a ram and a black ewe over the trench and let the blood run down into it. And they came. Brides, unmarried boys, old men who had suffered much, girls new to grief with the pain still fresh on them, and men killed in war, thousands of them, still in their armor with the wounds still on them, crowding up out of the dark, with a sound Homer describes as a kind of screaming. He was so frightened he nearly ran. He drew his sword and stood over the trench and held them all back from the blood, because Circe had been clear, not one of them drinks until Tiresias has drunk. The blood is what gives them back their minds for a few minutes. Without it, they are only shapes. So he stood there, sword out, keeping thousands of the dead off a hole in the ground, and made them queue. The first one to reach him was somebody he did not know was dead. His name was Elpenor, and he was the youngest man in the crew, not especially brave and not especially clever. On the last night at Circe's house, he had got drunk and gone up onto the roof to sleep in the cool air, and in the morning he had heard the others moving and stood up and forgotten entirely where he was, and walked straight off it and broken his neck. They had left in a hurry. Nobody had counted. His body was still lying in Circe's courtyard, unburned and unburied, and nobody had noticed he was gone. And now here he was, at the edge of the world, ahead of the prophet and the mother and the great heroes, asking his captain for one thing: go back, burn me with my armor, pile a mound on the shore and plant my oar on top of it, the one I used to row with when I was alive with you. Do not sail away and leave me unwept and unburied, or I will become something the gods hold against you. Odysseus promised. It is easy to skip past Elpenor. Everyone does. He is not important. That is the entire point of him. He dies of being drunk and clumsy. And the first thing the land of the dead has to say to the hero is, "You left a boy on a roof and did not notice." Then his mother came, Anticlea, and he had left her alive. He would not let her drink. That is in the poem, and it is almost unbearable. His own mother came up out of the dark to the edge of the trench, and he held her off with a sword and waited for the prophet, because those were the rules, and he followed them. Tiresias came and drank and spoke, and what he said is the entire remaining plot of this story, delivered in advance. You are looking for a sweet homecoming. A god will make it hard for you. You will not escape the Earthshaker, who has laid up anger in his heart because you blinded his son. Then the terms. They would come to an island where the cattle of the sun graze. If they left those cattle alone, they might all get home. If they touched them, Tiresias promised destruction. The ship, the crew, all of it. And Odysseus himself would come home late and badly, in another man's ship, having lost every companion, and he would find trouble in his house, arrogant men eating his substance and courting his wife. Every clause, word for word, the prayer of a blinded giant, being read back to him as prophecy. And then Tiresias told him something that made no sense at all, that even after he had killed the men in his house, he would have to leave again. He was to take an oar over his shoulder and walk inland, away from the sea, and keep walking, through country after country, until he came to a people who know nothing of the sea, who put no salt on their food, who have never seen a ship, and who would look at the thing on his shoulder and mistake it for a winnowing fan, a tool for throwing grain into the wind. There he was to plant the oar in the ground and make sacrifice to Poseidon, and then go home. And then death would come to him from the sea, very gently in a rich old age, with his people prosperous around him. Odysseus does not understand that instruction. Nobody in the poem explains it to him. Hold on to it, because it is the last thing this story does, and it is the only part of the prophecy that is not a punishment. Then he let his mother drink, and she knew him. He asked her how she died, whether it was sickness, whether Artemis had taken her with a gentle arrow, and she told him it was none of those things. She told him that his father was alive, but living out in the fields like a laborer, sleeping in the ashes by the fire in winter, and on the leaves in the vineyard in autumn, grieving. That his wife was still in the house, holding on, weeping through the nights. That his son held his lands. As for me, it was not sickness that took me. It was missing you. Your cleverness and your gentleness and longing for you took the life out of me. She had died of waiting, and he did what any human being would do, which was reach for her. 3 times, arms out, and 3 times she went through his hands like a shadow, like something in a dream, And he stood there in the dark at the edge of the world with his arms full of nothing, and asked her why she kept slipping away, whether she was a phantom Persephone had sent to torment him. And she explained, patiently, the way a mother explains a thing to a child. This is what happens to everyone. The sinews no longer hold the flesh and the bone, the fire takes it, and what is left flits about like a dream. But go back to the light, quickly, and remember all of this so you can tell your wife. He had sailed past the edge of the world for a prophecy. What he got was his mother, telling him she died of waiting for him, and that he had not been there. The rest of that night is a procession, and it is the reason the Greeks kept coming back to this passage for 1,000 years. He saw the great women of the old stories, queens and mothers of heroes, coming up one after another to drink and give their names. He saw Agamemnon, who had been at Troy with him a decade ago, who came up weeping and reached out and had no strength in his hands at all, and told him about the bath and the net and the axe, and about Cassandra dying beside him, and about the worst part of it, which was that his wife did not even close his eyes or shut his mouth as he lay there. And he gave Odysseus a warning that will matter in about 40 minutes of screen time. Never be too generous with a woman, and do not sail openly into your own harbor. Come home in secret. There is no trusting a welcome. And he saw Achilles, the greatest fighter of the age, dead at the height of his fame, exactly as he had chosen. The short life and the immortal name. Odysseus greeted him the way anyone would, that no man was ever more blessed, that he had been honored like a god among the Greeks in life and rules powerfully among the dead now, and that he should not grieve at dying. And Achilles cut him off. Do not gloss over death to me, glorious Odysseus. I would rather be alive and bound to the soil as the hired man of another, a landless man with nothing to his name, than be king over all the perished dead. That is the most quoted line in the poem, and possibly in Greek literature, and it is being said by the one man who had the choice explained to him in advance and picked the glory. Given the chance to say it again from the other side, with the fame secured and the songs already being sung, he says he would swap all of it to be a nobody with a body, working someone else's field in the sun. Then he asked about his son, and whether the boy had turned out brave. And when Odysseus told him that Neoptolemus was first into the horse and had never once gone pale, Achilles walked away across the field of asphodel, taking long strides, and Homer says he went rejoicing. The only happiness anyone gets in the underworld, and it is a father hearing his boy did well. Odysseus wanted to stay. He wanted to see the older heroes, the famous ones, Theseus and the rest. He stood there and waited for more. And the dead kept coming, in thousands, with that unearthly noise, until he was afraid that Persephone would send up something he could not look at. And he ran for the ship and shouted at the crew to cast off, and they went back down the river ocean on the current, with the north wind behind them. He came back from the land of the dead with 3 things: a route home, a prophecy he did not understand, and the knowledge that while he had been building a wooden horse and blinding a giant and spending a year in a witch's very comfortable house, his mother had lain down and died of missing him. Everything before this was an adventure. Men were lost, but there were monsters and tricks that worked, and stories to tell afterwards. From here it is only subtraction. They went back to Circe's island first and buried Elpenor. They burned him with his armor, heaped a mound on the headland, and planted his oar on top of it, exactly as he had asked. It took most of a day, and it changed nothing about their situation, and Odysseus did it anyway, because he had promised a dead boy on the far side of the world. Remember that oar standing in a mound of earth above the sea. This story is going to end with another one. Circe was waiting with food and wine, and something better than either. She had been to the underworld's edge herself, and now she told him what was coming in order with instructions, not prophecy. Briefing. She was the last piece of genuine help he would get from anyone. She told him about the Sirens, she told him about the 2 routes past the strait, and she told him about the cattle of the sun, and then she told him the thing he decided not to pass on. The Sirens first, because it is the one he survives cleanly, and it is worth understanding why. Everyone knows the shape of it. The singing, the wax, the ropes. What gets lost is what the Sirens are actually offering. It is not beauty and it is not sex. They call out to him by name, and they promise knowledge, that they know everything that happened at Troy, everything that happens anywhere on earth, and that no man has ever rode past without hearing it and going away wiser. They are offering the one thing Odysseus has never been able to walk past in his life. He went into the Cyclops' cave because he wanted to see who lived there. These are creatures that sing, "We will tell you everything," sitting in a meadow full of the bones of men who wanted to know. And this is the only trap in the entire poem that he beats before it starts. Because Circe told him in advance, and because he did something he has never done anywhere else in this story. He admitted in advance that he could not resist it. He did not back himself. He did not plan to be strong enough. He plugged his crew's ears with kneaded beeswax so they could not hear a note, and then had them tie him upright to the mast, hand and foot, with orders that if he begged to be released, they were to tie him tighter. And then he listened. They sang, and he lost his mind, and he signaled with his eyebrows for the men to let him go. And 2 of them got up and put more rope on him, and the ship kept moving, and the singing went behind them and out of hearing. That is the whole method, not willpower. Rope, wax, and an honest assessment of his own weakness made before the moment arrived. If he had done that once before, on the deck of a ship leaving a blinded giant's island, none of the rest of this would have happened. Then the strait and the arithmetic. Circe had laid out 2 options. One was the wandering rocks, which crush everything that goes through, and only one ship in the history of the world had ever survived them. The other was a channel with a cliff on one side and a low rock with a fig tree on the other. Under the fig tree is Charybdis, which is not a monster so much as a mouth in the sea. 3 times a day it sucks the entire channel down to the black sand, and 3 times a day it vomits it back up, and anything in the water when it draws is gone, not damaged. Gone, ship and all. In the cliff on the other side, in a cave too high to reach with an arrow, is Scylla. 6 necks, 6 heads, each with 3 rows of teeth. She hangs out of the cave, fishing the strait. Dolphins, seals, and any man on any deck that passes within reach. And she takes 1 man per head, and there is no fighting her, because she is not a creature that can be killed, and she is not a creature that can be avoided while you are also avoiding the thing across the water. Circe's advice was brutal and correct. Hug Scylla's cliff, row hard, lose 6 men. Do not even think about arming yourself against her, because if you stop to fight, she will simply come back and take 6 more. 6 certain deaths, or the whole ship. He took the 6. Any commander would. But he did not tell them. He told the crew about Charybdis. He told them to row hard past the smoke and the surf. He said nothing at all about the thing in the cliff above their heads, because, as he explains it himself, if he had told them, they would have stopped rowing and hidden below deck, and then everyone dies. He was probably right. It is still the coldest thing he ever does, and the poem does not let him off it. He also put his armor on and took 2 spears and stood on the foredeck watching the cliff, which Circe had specifically told him not to do, the one instruction he ignored. And he was still looking the wrong way when it happened, because he was watching the water. They were all watching the water. Charybdis was drawing on their left roaring, showing the black sand at the bottom of the sea, and every man on that ship had his eyes on it. And Scylla reached down over their heads and took 6 men off the deck behind him. He heard them. They were lifted up past the cliff face, still holding their hands out to him, still calling his name, and she ate them at the mouth of the cave, where he could see it. Homer gives it one of the strangest and most exact images in the poem, like an angler on a rock, dangling bait for small fish, who hooks one and flings it gasping onto the shore. That is what it looked like. 6 men going up a cliff, kicking. That was the most pitiful thing I saw in all my sufferings on the sea. He had done the correct arithmetic. He had made the only survivable choice available, and what it brought him was standing on a deck in his armor, unable to do a single thing, while 6 men who trusted him and had not been told were lifted into the air, shouting for him by name. And then they came to Thrinacia and heard cattle lowing. Odysseus tried to sail past it. This is important. Both Tiresias and Circe had warned him, and he had listened. He stood up on that deck and told his exhausted crew that this was the one island they must not touch, and to steer wide of it. And Eurylochus, who has been with him since Troy, who lost his men in Circe's sty, who has watched 11 ships smashed and 6 friends eaten off the deck that morning, said no, and his speech is entirely reasonable. You are made of iron. You never get tired. The rest of us are exhausted, and you will not even let us set foot on land to cook a meal and sleep. Night is coming. Storms come at night. Let us sleep on the beach and sail at dawn. The whole crew agreed with him. So Odysseus made them swear a great oath first. Nobody touches a single animal, only the food Circe had put aboard. They swore it, all of them, and they meant it. They went ashore and cooked and wept for the 6 men and slept. And in the night the south wind came up, and it blew for a month, a full month, pinned on that beach, and it never once turned. The ship's provisions ran out. Then they were snaring birds and fishing with bent hooks from the rocks, and hunger was working on them the way hunger does. And then Odysseus went inland to pray for help, walked off alone into the island to ask the gods for a way out. And while he was gone, Eurylochus said the thing that ends this. All deaths are hateful, but the most pitiful is to die of hunger. Let us drive off the best of the cattle and sacrifice to the gods, and if we get home to Ithaca, we will build Helios a rich temple. And if he wants to wreck the ship for his cows and the other gods agree, I would rather go down in one gulp of the sea than starve slowly on a desert island. That is not the speech of a villain. That is a starving man choosing a fast death over a slow one and offering to pay for it. They took the best of the herd. They had no barley for the ritual, so they used oak leaves, and no wine, so they used water. And they did the rite as properly as men can do it with leaves and water, and they ate. And the poem says, the hides crawled, and the meat on the spits, cooked and raw both, began to low like cattle. Odysseus woke on the mountain, smelled the roasting, and understood immediately. Helios went to Zeus and demanded payment, and the threat he made is the reason it worked. If he was not paid, he would take the sun down into the house of Hades and shine among the dead instead. Zeus agreed to smash the ship. They ate for 6 days. On the 7th, the wind dropped and they sailed, and as soon as they were out of sight of land, the sky went black, and a white squall took the mast down across the helmsman's skull, and a thunderbolt hit the ship and filled it with sulphur, and every man went into the water and was carried past the hull like a flock of seabirds, all of them, of every man who had eaten, everyone who had sworn the oath and broken it. Eurylochus, who had been right about the storm and wrong about the cattle, everyone who had been at Troy for 10 years and had almost made it. Odysseus was the only one who had not eaten. He lashed the keel and the mast together with a leather backstay and rowed them, and the wind shifted and carried him back. North, up the strait, straight at Charybdis, in the dark. She swallowed the raft. He got to the fig tree on the rock above her as it went down and hung there. Arms out, no branch to sit on, no bottom to stand on, gripping the tree over a hole in the sea. And hung there through the whole cycle, hours of it, waiting for the mast and keel to be spat back up. Homer's image for how long he waited is a man waiting for his dinner. And when the timbers came up, he dropped on top of them and paddled with his hands. And Zeus did not let Scylla see him go past. 9 days in open water. On the 10th night, an island. 600 men left Troy with him. He came off that wreck alone, holding a piece of it. And that is how he arrived at the beach where this story started. Ogygia, an island at the navel of the sea, with a cave in a wood of alder and poplar and cypress, with owls and falcons and sea crows in the branches, and a vine heavy with grapes trained across the mouth of it, and 4 springs running clear water in 4 directions through meadows of violet and parsley. Homer stops the narrative to describe it and says that even a god passing by would stand and look at it and feel delight. It is, by some distance, the most beautiful place in the poem. He was there for 7 years. Calypso pulled him out of the surf half dead and kept him, and she is not a monster, and the poem never calls her one. She fed him, she loved him, genuinely, as far as anyone can tell. And she wanted to keep him forever, and she had the power to do it. And she made him an offer that nobody else in Greek myth is ever made and refuses. She offered to make him immortal, not long-lived, not lucky, immortal and ageless permanently. The thing every hero in every one of these stories is circling. Achilles picked a short life for a song about him. The whole architecture of Greek heroism is built on the fact that men die and gods do not. And here is a goddess offering to simply remove the distinction, along with the island and the cave and herself forever. And she says out loud what she thinks of the alternative. That she cannot be worse than Penelope, that no mortal woman can compete with a goddess in form or stature, and she is not boasting. She is right, and Odysseus tells her so. Goddess, do not be angry with me. I know all of this. I know Penelope is nothing beside you to look at. She is mortal, and you do not age or die. But even so, all my days I want to go home. He would rather grow old and die on a small rocky island with bad farmland than not die at all, somewhere beautiful. That is the answer to the question the whole story opened on, and it is worth being precise about what makes it strange. He is not choosing his wife over Calypso, exactly. He is choosing a specific set of ordinary things. A wife who has aged 20 years, a son he has never spoken to, an old father sleeping in the ashes, a hall, a dog, a bed. Over paradise and eternity. The Greeks were not sentimental people. They wrote the man who invented the horse and the man who stoned Palamedes. And when they wanted to say what a life was actually for, this is the scene they built. A man on a beautiful beach, offered the one thing that cannot be had, saying no, and crying about it every afternoon for 7 years, because he could not leave. That is the part that gets lost when this scene is told as a romance. Nights he would sleep beside her in the hollow cave, unwilling beside a goddess who was willing. 7 years. And every day he sat on the rocks and looked at the water in the direction of home. He had no ship, he had no crew, there was no land within reach and no vessel to reach it in, and the goddess who owned the island had no reason on earth to help him leave. He was not trapped by a monster or a curse. He was trapped by kindness in the most beautiful place in the world, with everything he could want except the ability to go. What finally moved was politics. Athena raised it in council on Olympus and picked her moment. She waited until Poseidon was away, off among the Ethiopians receiving sacrifices. That is how this gets solved. Not by heroism, by a goddess timing an agenda item for a meeting her opponent could not attend. She made the case that Odysseus had done everything right at Troy and had been forgotten, that he was lying on an island weeping while a goddess kept him, that his son was about to be murdered by the men eating his house. Zeus agreed and sent Hermes to Ogygia with an order. Calypso received him and knew exactly what he had come for before he said it, and her response is one of the sharpest things in the poem. She told the messenger of the gods that they were cruel and jealous beyond all others, that they cannot stand it when a goddess takes a mortal man to her bed, and she listed the other goddesses who had tried and the gods who had killed the men for it. And then, having said it, she obeyed. I have no ship and no crew to send him, but I will advise him honestly and hide nothing, so that he may come unharmed to his own country. She went and found him on the shore, where he was, as always, crying, and told him she was letting him go, and he did not believe her. He assumed it was a trap and refused to set foot on a raft until she swore the great oath of the gods that she was not planning something. She laughed at him and swore it. And then she said something that only she could say, because only she knew. If you knew how much suffering is written for you before you get home, you would stay here with me and be immortal. No matter how much you want to see your wife. He said he knew, and he was going anyway. She gave him tools. He built a raft himself over 4 days. Cut 20 trees, trimmed them, bored and fitted them, made a mast and a yard and a steering oar, wove withies for a rail, and she brought him cloth for a sail, and he rigged it. She washed him and dressed him, and provisioned him with bread and water and dark wine, and sent a warm wind after him. 17 days he sailed, alone, steering by the Pleiades and the Bear, the one constellation that never bathes in the sea, keeping her on his left hand, as Calypso had told him. On the 18th day, he saw land, and Poseidon, coming back from the Ethiopians, looked down and saw him. The god said, more or less, while I was away, they have arranged things for him. And then gathered the clouds and took the sea in both hands and roused every wind at once. The raft came apart, the mast broke. He went into the water with the sail on top of him and could not get up for a long time because his clothes were dragging him down, and when he surfaced, he spat brine and got back on a plank. 2 days, 2 nights. In open water on a piece of a raft, with the currents taking him back and forth. A sea nymph named Ino, who had been a mortal woman once, surfaced and gave him a veil and told him to strip, abandon the raft, and swim. And he did not trust her either. He decided to stay on the timbers as long as they held and only use the veil when he had no choice, which is the single most characteristic decision he makes in the entire poem. The timbers came apart. He used the veil. 2 more days swimming and then a coastline. And the coastline was worse than the sea because it was cliff and reef with the surf going up it. And when he tried to grab the rock, a wave tore him off, and the skin came off his hands and stayed on the stone, as when an octopus is dragged out of its hole and pebbles stick to its suckers. So the skin was stripped from his hands on the rock. He swam along the coast until he found a river mouth and prayed to the river, and the river stopped its current for him. He crawled out. He could not stand. Sea water was running out of his mouth and nose, and he had no breath and no voice, and Homer says his heart and his knees had given up. He went up the bank and found 2 olive bushes grown together, one wild and one cultivated, so thick that no wind or rain or sun got through, and he scraped together a pile of dead leaves, enough for 2 or 3 men to sleep under in winter, and buried himself in it. As a man buries a glowing brand in the black ashes at the edge of a farm with no neighbors near to keep a seed of fire alive so he will not have to go somewhere else to fetch it. That is the last image of him before he is found. Not a hero, a coal banked under ashes, being kept alight because there is nowhere else to get fire from. He was woken by girls screaming because a princess was playing ball on the beach. Nausicaa had come down to the river to do the palace laundry, and when the ball went into the water and her maid screamed, a naked, salt-crusted, wild-looking man came out of a bush, holding a branch in front of himself. Everyone ran except her. She stood and heard him out, and gave him clothes and oil and food and directions, and told him with startling practicality to walk into the city behind her rather than beside her, because people talk. The Phaeacians were the last people in the world who still lived close to the gods. Their ships needed no steersman. They knew by themselves where every man wanted to go. And when the beggar in their hall finally gave his name, he told them the whole story. The Cyclops, the bag of winds, the witch, the dead, the strait, the cattle, the island. All of it, in his own voice, over one night. The entire middle of this story is a man telling it out loud to strangers, and that is not an accident of structure. He gets to Ithaca by being able to explain what happened to him. Then they loaded him with more treasure than he had brought back from Troy, put him on a ship, and he lay down on the deck and fell into a sleep Homer says was very like death. And he came into the harbor of Ithaca after 20 years, after everything, asleep and unconscious and carried in another man's ship, exactly as a blind giant had asked for. The Phaeacians carried him ashore still asleep, laid him on the sand with all his treasure stacked beside him, and sailed away. Poseidon turned their ship to stone in sight of their own harbor on the way back for the crime of ferrying him. But that is their story, and they paid it. Odysseus woke up on the beach of Ithaca and did not know where he was. 20 years. Athena had put a mist over the place, and he stood up on his own shore, looked at his own harbor and his own hills, and did not recognize a thing. And his first reaction, after 20 years on the sand of home, was to count the treasure to see whether the Phaeacians had cheated him. Nothing was missing. He walked along the beach beside the sea, crying. Athena came to him as a young shepherd, and he told her a lie. That is his first act in his own country, a total, fluent, unnecessary invention about being a Cretan who had killed a man and fled. He does it before he knows who he is talking to, reflexively, the way another man would clear his throat. And the goddess laughed and changed into a tall woman and told him he was the most incorrigible liar alive, that even in his own land, safe, he could not put the deceptions down. And she said it with something close to affection. That is why I cannot desert you, because you are civilized and quick and self-possessed. Then she told him the truth about his house. For 3 years, the young nobility of Ithaca and the islands around it had been living in his hall, 108 of them. They were eating his herds, daily, dozens of animals a day, drinking his wine, sleeping with his serving women, courting his wife, and waiting for her to choose one of them. They were doing this inside his house, with his son sitting there watching, and they had recently begun discussing the practicalities of murdering the boy. And Odysseus, who had just been offered eternity on a beautiful island and turned it down for this, said, "Thank the gods you told me, or I would have walked into that hall and been killed like Agamemnon. Then he asked her to make him unrecognizable. She did more than that. She withered the skin on his arms and legs, took the dark hair off his head, put the eyes of an old man in his face, and dressed him in a filthy tunic and a stinking deerskin with a bag on a piece of rope. He had spent his whole life becoming someone whose name opened doors from Sparta to Egypt. He put the name down at the border and went into his own house as nothing. Nobody had worked before. He went first to the pig farm. Eumaeus had been a swineherd on Ithaca for most of his life. He was born a prince, actually, stolen as a child by a Phoenician woman and sold. And Laertes had bought him and raised him in the house, and now he lived out in the hills with the boars and slept outside among them in the cold. He had not seen his master in 20 years. Every stranger who came through told him lies about Odysseus for a meal, and he had stopped believing any of them. And when a filthy old beggar turned up at his gate and the dogs went for him, Eumaeus ran out, drove them off with stones, took him inside, sat him on brushwood with a goat skin over it, killed 2 of his own suckling pigs, and apologized for the poor quality of the meat. Because the good animals went to the men in the hall, and there was nothing he could do about it. "Strangers and beggars come from Zeus," he said. "My gift is small, but it is what I have." Then he spent the evening talking about the man he still worked for, who he was certain was dead, and about how much he had loved him. He is the one who does not fail. In a poem where kings sacrifice daughters and crews open bags and heroes cannot resist boasting, a slave who was told nothing and promised nothing simply kept doing his job correctly for 20 years for a dead man, out of loyalty to a household that could no longer check on him. And where had the son been? Telemachus was a few months old when his father left, and he was 20 when this began. And for the whole of that time, he had been a boy in a house full of grown men who were eating his inheritance and did not take him seriously. He had never once been out of Ithaca. He had no idea what his father looked like. All he had was his mother's grief and a house that got emptier every year. And then Athena came to him disguised as an old family friend and told him to stop sitting in it. So he did the one thing nobody expected. He called an assembly, the first one held on Ithaca in 20 years, and stood up in front of the whole island and told them what was happening in his house and asked for help. And nobody helped him. The suitors' answer, delivered publicly, was that it was Penelope's fault for stringing them along with a shroud, and that they were not leaving until she chose. An old man pointed out that an omen of eagles had just torn each other apart overhead, and that this was going to end badly, and was laughed at. The assembly broke up, having decided nothing. That is the moment the boy stops being a boy. He asked his own people for justice, in the open, correctly, and watched them decline. So he stole a ship. He borrowed a vessel and a crew without telling his mother and slipped out of the harbor at night and went to find out whether his father was alive. He went first to Pylos, to old Nestor, who had got home clean and easy and who was still telling long stories and who could tell him about Troy and about the storm and about Agamemnon's murder, but nothing about Odysseus. And then overland to Sparta, to Menelaus. And that is the strangest visit in Greek literature, because Telemachus walks into the house at the center of the whole catastrophe and finds it quiet and rich and unbearably sad. Menelaus is enormously wealthy from 8 years of drifting and cannot enjoy any of it. He says out loud that he would give up 2/3 of everything he owns to have his friends back alive, the men who died at Troy for his marriage. And that of all of them, he grieves for one most, and cannot sleep or eat for thinking about him, because nobody suffered more than Odysseus. And Helen came down. Helen. the most beautiful woman in the world, the reason for all of it, 10 years of war and a burned city and 1,000 dead. She came into the room, recognized the boy instantly from his resemblance to his father, and named him before anyone told her who he was. And then the four of them began to cry, all at once, about their various dead. So she put a drug in the wine. She had got it in Egypt, and Homer says it takes away grief and anger and the memory of every sorrow. That a man who drank it would not weep that day, even if his mother and father died, even if his brother or his son were killed in front of him with a sword. She dosed the room, and then she told a charming story about Troy, in which she came off rather well. That is the last we see of the woman the war was fought over, hosting a dinner party, drugging the guests so the evening does not get maudlin, and telling a flattering anecdote. Menelaus gave the boy what he had come for. He told him about wrestling the shape-shifting sea god on the beach in Egypt, and about what the god had said, that Odysseus was alive, weeping on an island, held by a nymph with no ship and no crew. Telemachus had an answer at last, and back on Ithaca the suitors had worked out that he was gone and put a warship in the strait to kill him on the way home. He got past them because a goddess told him which way to sail. He came ashore in secret on a beach on the far side of the island, sent the ship onto town without him, and walked inland to the one house on Ithaca where he knew he could trust the man who lived in it. Telemachus came to that hut, and Athena let the disguise drop, and a father and a son who had never had a conversation had one. The boy did not believe it either. He thought it was a god playing with him, because a moment ago there had been a beggar, and now there was a man in fresh clothes, and no mortal does that. It took some convincing, and then they sat down and planned a massacre. 2 days later the beggar walked into town with the swineherd and came to his own gate, and there was a dog lying on a heap of dung outside it. His name was Argos. Odysseus had raised him from a puppy and had never hunted with him because the war had come and he had gone before the dog was old enough. For 20 years he had lain around a house where nobody fed him properly anymore, full of ticks, too weak to stand. He heard the voice. Homer gives it 4 lines. The dog lifted his head. He put his ears forward. He did not have the strength to get up, so he wagged his tail and tried to move towards him. And Odysseus, standing in front of a slave he had just been talking to for 2 days, turned his face away and wiped his eyes so that Eumaeus would not see, and asked, casually, what a fine-looking animal like that was doing on a dunghill. Eumaeus said he had been the best tracker in the country once, and that servants get lazy when the master is gone. And Argos, having seen Odysseus in the 20th year, died. The only one in that entire house who knew him on sight was the dog. He knew instantly. No test, no scar, no bed, no 20 questions. A voice at the gate after 20 years, and he was certain. And the one thing his master could not do was say a single word to him. Inside was worse. He went around the hall begging from his own guests, table by table, holding out his hands to men who were eating his cattle, and most of them gave him something. Carelessly, the way you do. And one of them did not. Antinous was the worst of them, and the leader of the group that wanted Telemachus dead. He told the beggar to get away from his table, and when the beggar answered him back, pointing out mildly that a man who gave nothing from someone else's food had a strange idea of generosity, Antinous picked up a footstool and threw it at him and hit him in the back at the base of the shoulder. He stood there like a rock and did not move, and shook his head slowly and thought about killing. Even the other suitors thought that was too far. One of them said out loud that it was a bad idea to throw things at strangers because gods walk the earth disguised as travelers, watching how men behave. Nobody in that hall listened, but note what they were afraid of. And note that they were exactly right about what was standing in front of them and wrong only about the species. They also made him fight. There was another beggar in the house, a big, loud young man called Iris, who ran errands for the suitors and did not want competition, and he challenged the old man to a fist fight for the doorway. The suitors thought this was wonderful. They put up a prize of goat stomachs stuffed with fat and promised the winner permanent rights to beg in the hall. And when the old man pulled his rags up to fight, the room went quiet, because there were thighs and shoulders and arms under there that did not belong on a beggar. And Iris began to shake, and the servants had to push him forward. Odysseus considered killing him with one punch and decided a lighter one would attract less attention. He broke his jaw, dragged him out by the foot, propped him against the wall, put his stick in his hand, and told him to sit there and keep the dogs and pigs away. Then he went back inside and let them laugh at him some more. That is the discipline of the whole chapter. He is standing in the middle of everything he owns, being hit with furniture by men who are eating his animals and sleeping with his maids, and every hour he waits is deliberate. Because there are 108 of them and one of him, and the only way this works is if not one person in that building knows what he is. That night Penelope came down and interviewed the beggar herself. He lied to her too. The Cretan story again, richer this time. And in the middle of it, he told her he had once entertained her husband and described the clothes Odysseus had been wearing when he left 20 years ago. The brooch, the tunic, like dry onion skin. Details only 2 people in the world would know. She wept while he described his own coat, and he watched her do it. Homer says his eyes stayed as still as horn or iron, and he had to hold them there by force. And he did not tell her. Then she ordered the old nurse to wash the stranger's feet. Eurycleia had nursed Odysseus as a baby. She brought the basin and knelt and said the stranger reminded her of her master, and put her hands into the water and onto his leg, and found the scar. He had got it as a boy, boar hunting on Mount Parnassus with his grandfather. The animal came out of a thicket and took him above the knee before he killed it. It was the mark everyone in that household knew. She dropped his foot. It went down into the basin and knocked it over, and the water went everywhere, and her eyes filled, and she turned to call Penelope across the room. And he caught her by the throat with one hand and pulled her face down to his, and told her that if she said one word, he would kill her along with everyone else when the time came, nurse or no nurse. She swore, and she kept it. So by the end of that night, the house contained one man who knew him and had been threatened into silence, one son who knew and was pretending not to, one swineherd who did not know, 108 men who would not have believed it, and a wife who had been given every clue except the one that counted. And Penelope, upstairs, was arranging something none of them expected. Because the day after a beggar arrived, swearing her husband was alive and nearby. After 20 years of refusing every man in the building. She was about to announce that she had made her decision and set them a contest to win her. Which raises the question that the whole last movement of this story turns on. She is the cleverest woman in Greek literature, married to the cleverest man in it. What did she know? And when did she work it out? Penelope had been holding that house for 20 years with nothing but her mind. She could not throw the suitors out. There were 108 of them, and they were the sons of the most powerful families in the islands. She could not refuse to remarry outright. A woman whose husband had been missing for 2 decades was, by every custom they had, available, and her own father had been telling her to choose. And she could not simply say no forever, because they were eating the estate her son would inherit. Every month she delayed, there was less of it left. so she bought time with a piece of cloth. She told them she would choose a husband as soon as she had finished weaving a shroud for Laertes, her husband's father, who was old and would need one, because it would be a disgrace to the family if the old man were buried without one. Nobody could argue with that. It was pious, it was reasonable, and it was the sort of duty a good daughter-in-law was supposed to insist on. She wove it all day, and every night she brought torches into the room and unpicked what she had done. 3 years. She ran that for 3 years, and it only ended because one of her maids told them, and they caught her at it in the middle of the night and made her finish it. That is the trick this story is actually built on, and it deserves to be said plainly. The most famous deception in the Odyssey is not the wooden horse. It is a woman doing the same day's work 300 times so that no one can accuse her of refusing. And then, the morning after a strange old beggar told her that her husband was alive and close, she came down and announced that she was done. She would set them a contest and marry whoever won it. She had them bring out a bow. It had belonged to Odysseus, a gift from a man he had met once as a boy, made of horn, and he had never taken it to Troy. He had left it in the storeroom for 20 years. She carried it down herself with the quiver, and she sat and cried over it before she could put it on the table. The test was the one he used to do: string the bow and shoot an arrow through the sockets of 12 axe heads set up in a line. Every man in that room understood immediately that this was hard. What none of them appeared to consider is that she had chosen the one test in the world that only her husband could pass. On the morning after, she was told he had come back. Telemachus went first, half as a joke, and very nearly did it. He got it up 3 times and was bending it the 4th when his father caught his eye and shook his head, and he put it down and said he was too young. Then the suitors, in order, by seating position. The first man could not move it at all. They sent for fat and a fire, and started warming and greasing the wood to make it supple, and passed it along the line. Every one of them tried, every one of them failed. Antinous, who had the best of it, kept putting it off. He suggested they leave it for the next day, when they had made proper sacrifices to Apollo, which is the standard excuse of a man who has just discovered he cannot do something in public. And the beggar in the corner asked whether he might have a go. Just to see, he said, whether there was any strength left in his arms. The room reacted the way rooms do. Antinous told him he was drunk and threatened him. One of them said that if he strung it, they would put him on a ship and sell him to a king who mutilated people. Penelope shut them down. She pointed out coolly that nobody was suggesting the old man would actually marry her, and that the objection could only be that they were frightened of being embarrassed by a beggar. Telemachus sent his mother upstairs, and she went, which she did not have to do, and slept for the first time in 20 years while it happened underneath her. They put the bow in his hands, and he turned it over slowly, checking the horn for worm. A man inspecting a tool he had not seen in 20 years and had made himself. While the suitors made jokes about how he was obviously a connoisseur of bows. Then he strung it, sitting down, without effort. One motion, the way a musician who has done it 10,000 times fits a new string to a lyre and turns the peg. And he plucked the string with his right hand, and it sang out with a note like a swallow. Every man in that room went pale, and Zeus put a clap of thunder over the house. He took one arrow off the table. He did not stand up. He drew it back to his ear and put it through all 12 axe heads and out the other side. And then he said quietly to his son, "The guest in your hall has not disgraced you. Now it is time to make these men their supper, while it is still light." And he nodded, and Telemachus put on his sword and took his spear and came and stood beside his father's chair. Then Odysseus jumped up onto the threshold with the bow and poured the arrows out at his feet and threw off his rags. Now that contest is finished. Let us see whether Apollo will grant me another mark. He shot Antinous through the throat while the man was lifting a two-handled gold cup to drink. The room did not understand for several seconds. They shouted at him. They thought it was an accident. They told him he had killed the best young man in Ithaca and that the vultures would have him for it. And then he told them who he was, and there was a very short silence. And then the entire hall tried to find a way out. There was no way out. The doors were locked. Eumaeus and the cowherd Philoetius were on them. Telemachus had already moved the weapons out of the hall days earlier and stacked them in a storeroom, and the only reason the fight lasted as long as it did was that a disloyal servant got in there and brought armor and spears out to the suitors before they were caught. They were penned. They had numbers and no exit and nothing to fight with for the first part of it, and Odysseus stood on the raised threshold with a bow and then a spear and worked. The poem doesn't look away, but this is not the part worth dwelling on. What matters is the shape of it. 108 men who had spent 3 years treating another man's house as their own were killed in it, in an afternoon, by 4 people. Some of them begged. The priest begged, and was killed anyway because he had prayed for the marriage. 1 man was cut down running for the door with his hands out. 2 were spared. The bard, because a singer is under the protection of the gods, and he had only ever performed under compulsion. And Telemachus vouched for him, and the herald, because he had been kind to Telemachus as a child. And the boy said so out loud in the middle of the killing, and his father accepted it. Both times, someone had to speak up in the moment for the killing to stop. Odysseus did not sort the innocent from the guilty himself. He was, by that point, past sorting. Then the 12 maids. There were 50 women in that household. 12 of them had been sleeping with the suitors. And the poem is not honest about how much choice they had in it, though it does let us see enough to know. Eurycleia named them. They were made to carry the bodies of the men out of the hall and to scrub the tables and the floor with sponges and water. And when the hall was clean, they were taken outside and hanged in a row in the courtyard. Homer compares them to thrushes or doves caught in a net on their way to roost, and says their feet twitched a little, but not for long. It is the ugliest thing in the poem. It is done by the man we have spent 3 hours traveling home with. And the poet, who has given us the dog and the mother's shade and the scar and the man crying on the beach, chose to describe 12 enslaved women being executed for what was done to them with an image about small birds. The Greeks did not think their hero was gentle. They thought he was owed, and they wrote down exactly what being owed looks like when it finally arrives, and they did not soften it. And then they made the last chapter of the poem argue about whether he had gone too far. The house was cleaned with fire and sulfur. The old nurse went upstairs, delighted, to tell Penelope that her husband had come home and killed them all. And Penelope did not believe her. She said it must be a god. She said her husband was dead, far from home. She came downstairs and sat by the fire opposite a man covered in other people's blood, and looked at him and said nothing at all. Her son called her hard-hearted in front of everyone. Any other wife, he said, would have run to him, and Odysseus told his son to leave her alone. Let your mother test me. She will know me better presently. He knew exactly what she was doing. He had spent 20 years doing it. He washed and changed, and Athena put the years back on him. Tall again, dark-haired, looking like an immortal. And he came and sat down opposite his wife and said with some bitterness that no other woman in the world would keep her distance from a husband who had come home after 20 years. And then he turned to the nurse and asked her to make him a bed. He would sleep alone. Clearly this woman had a heart of iron. And Penelope said, "Yes, move the bed." She told Euryclea to take the sturdy bedstead out of the bridal chamber he had built himself and make it up outside the room with fleeces and blankets. And Odysseus, who had lied to a Cyclops, to a goddess, to a king of the Phaeacians, to a swineherd, to his own son, to his own father, to his own wife twice in 2 days, without one flicker of anything, came apart. Woman, that is a bitter thing to say. Who has moved my bed? No living man could do it, however strong, unless a god came and shifted it. And then he told her how he had made it. There had been an olive tree growing in the yard when he built the house. A long-leafed olive, thick as a pillar, in full growth. He built the bedroom around it. He walled the tree in on all 4 sides, roofed it, fitted the doors. Then he cut the crown off the trunk and trimmed the stump from the root up and smoothed it with an adze and made it true to the line and bored it and used it as the bedpost and built the rest of the bed onto it and inlaid it with gold and silver and ivory and strung it with oxhide. One leg of that bed is a living tree with its roots still in the ground under the floor. That is the token. And I do not know, woman, whether the bed is still there, or whether some man has cut through the olive stump and moved it. Her knees went. She ran across the room and put her arms around his neck and kissed his face and told him not to be angry with her, that she had been frightened for 20 years that some man would come with a good story and take her in, that there are plenty of men who plan such things, and that she had needed one sign that no one else in the world could give. And Homer says, as land looks to men who are swimming, men whose ship has been broken by the sea and who have swum a long way, and a few of them get out of the grey water and stand on the shore with the salt caked on their skin, glad to have escaped. That is how welcome her husband looked to her as she looked at him. He is the one who has been swimming in every literal sense for 10 years, and the poem gives her the shipwreck. They cried, and it says they would have gone on crying until dawn if Athena had not held the night back, literally kept the dawn horses in their stalls, so they could have longer. So the recognition is not the bow, not the scar, which a nurse found by accident, not the arrow through 12 axes, not the killing of 108 men, which proved nothing about who he was, except that he was dangerous. It is a secret about a bed built around a tree that is still alive. He gets back into his own house by finally, involuntarily, telling the truth about something he made with his hands. And he only does it because someone threatened to move it. 20 years of being the cleverest man in the world got him to the door. Being unable to lie about one piece of furniture is what got him through it. And then, in the middle of that night, he told her it was not over. Because Tiresias had given him one more instruction in the land of the dead, and it had made no sense at the time. He had to leave again, take an oar on his shoulder and walk inland, away from the sea, and keep walking through country after country until he came to a people who know nothing of ships, who put no salt on their food, who have never seen a painted prow or an oar in their lives. And he would know he had arrived when a stranger on the road stopped him and asked why he was carrying a winnowing fan on his shoulder, a farmer's tool for throwing threshed grain into the wind to separate it from the chaff. There he was to plant the oar in the ground and sacrifice to Poseidon and go home. Think about what that actually is. The oar is the thing he is. It is the sea and the 12 ships and the crew and Troy and the whole life that has cost him 20 years and everyone he ever commanded. And the penance is to carry it personally on his own shoulder until he reaches somewhere so far inland that the most important object in his life is mistaken for a farm implement. He has to walk until his own story means nothing to anybody. The man who could not sail away from an island without shouting his name across the water has to go and stand somewhere his name has never been heard and put the oar in the dirt and leave it there. And then, Tiresias said, death would come to him from the sea, very gently, in a rich old age, with his people prosperous around him. That is the only clause in the whole prophecy that is not a punishment. It is the reward, and it is on the other side of the walk. There was one more morning of trouble. The families of the dead came for him. 108 households with a funeral each, gathering under arms in the town. His father, Laertes, came out of the vineyard and put armor on for the first time in decades, and threw a spear and killed a man, and was happy about it. And Athena stopped it with one word. She came down and shouted at them to stop, and the weapons fell out of their hands, and the men who had come to avenge their sons turned around and ran for the town. Odysseus went after them anyway, screaming, still going, 20 years of it in him. And Zeus put a thunderbolt in the ground at Athena's feet, and she told him to stop before Zeus got angry. And he did. And Homer says he was glad in his heart to be told to stop. Then the goddess made both sides forget. She put an oath between them and wiped the killing out of the island's memory, and there was peace. That is how it ends. Not with justice or a trial or reconciliation, with a god telling everybody to forget it and a man relieved that someone finally made him put it down. And somewhere behind all of it, on an island at the navel of the sea, is a cave with a vine over the mouth of it, and 4 springs running through meadows of violet and parsley, where a goddess once offered a crying man on a beach the one thing that no human being has ever been offered before or since. Never grow old, never die. Stay here with me in the most beautiful place in the world, forever. And he said no, and went back to a rocky island with bad farmland, and a wife who had aged 20 years, and a father sleeping in the ashes, and a boy who did not know him, and a dog that died in the road, and a bed with a tree in it. He chose all of it, knowing what it would cost, having been told in advance, in detail, by a goddess who was not lying. That is the answer to the question we started with. It began with 3 women and a piece of fruit. An uninvited guest rolled a golden apple across a wedding floor with 2 words on it, and a boy on a hillside made a choice, and 1,000 ships went east, and a girl was killed for a wind, and a city came down in one night, and every king who walked out of it was handed a bill. None of them thought they were choosing anything at the time. That is the part the Greeks kept insisting on. Nobody in this story ever gets to see the invoice while there is still time to refuse the purchase. The Greeks had a word for the homecoming, Nostos, and they had another word for the pain of it, the ache of the road back, the thing Odysseus felt on that beach every afternoon for 7 years. They put the 2 together and we still use it, nostalgia. Literally, the pain of returning home. It is a word about a man on a rock facing the water, crying. And we now use it for a song from when we were young. That is what 3,000 years does to a language. But the original meaning is the truer one, and anyone who has ever gone back to a place after long enough knows exactly which definition is correct. Because the story is not really about monsters, the Cyclops takes 20 minutes, the witch takes a year. What takes 20 years is a man learning that he cannot walk back into his own house as the thing the war made him, that the bow and the killing and the cleverness get him as far as the door and not one step further. His wife will not have the man who sacked cities, she will only have the man who built a bed. And the last thing the gods ask of him is not another battle. It is to pick up an oar and carry it inland until nobody knows what it is. If this is the kind of story you want more of, the complete Norse mythology is already here on the channel. Creation to Ragnarok, the gods who read the prophecy of their own deaths and went to the battlefield anyway. And the complete Hindu cosmos is here too, the one that ends and begins again forever. Subscribe and the next mythology will find you. Thank you for staying to the end of this one.